Debra Fileta, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate your time.
Oh, it's so good to be with you.
Now, you are an author of many books now, including the one some may be familiar with through your site, True Love Dates, but also your latest, Are You Really Okay? And as a licensed counsellor, we're basically having a group therapy session for everyone right now and kind
Love
of
it.
diving into some of the wisdom, in both of those regards right now. Looking at that perspective of health, of wellness, they're two words that you hear used in so many different contexts these days. What does being truly healthy, truly well mean to you?
It's such a complex question because really health has so many different layers to it. There's so many different aspects to health. But when we're talking about health, I like to kind of see it in four different parts. Jesus calls us to love the Lord with our heart, soul, mind, and strength. So, what does that mean practically? To me, heart means our emotional health, soul, our spiritual health, mind, our mental health, strength, our physical health. So when we're talking about health, we're talking about all of these different components of who we are and how they impact our life.
Okay, so when you think of the idea of asking whether or not we are really okay, that to me would bring up a lot of red flags, things we should be looking for, how we know whether we're okay or not. What are the things you think are the markers that we're not doing all right?
You want to break it down into different questions that you can ask yourself. First and foremost, how are you doing emotionally with regard to your emotional expression, how your emotions are impacting you? Are they in control of you, or are you in control of them? You know, and do you have more emotions during the day that are negative and destructive, or more emotions that are positive and helpful? So that's one aspect. What about our mind, our thought life?
Hmm.
Are we the type of person that struggles more with negative thinking? How they say the glass is always half empty. Well, the truth is, you're not born an optimist or a pessimist. That's
Hmm.
something you learn along the way based on your thoughts, based on the filter that you see life with. So, what are your thought life look like? What about your behaviors? Are you engaging in behaviors that are bringing you down and harmful? Addictions, or too much Netflix, or you can't get off your phone, alcohol, drugs, sex? Or is it things that are positive and lifting you up? And what about your relationships? You got to look at the
Hmm.
health of your overall relationships, because something people don't realize is that the health of our relationships is actually a reflection of our personal health,
Hmm.
because we attract people and engage with people on our level of health. So sometimes you just have to look out at your relationships and ask yourself, okay, what do my relationships tell me about
Hmm.
how I'm doing personally?
And that can be a really confronting thought, because if you're looking out at those relationships and thinking, oh, these aren't as rich or as connected as I would hope they would be, that's difficult if you're going to have to look inwardly to really work out why that is.
Yeah, and not only that, but you might find yourself in a pattern of unhealthy relationships,
Mm.
drama, conflict, abuse, or just, I get men and women who are like, why do I always attract these unhealthy relationships? We
Mm.
have to step back and say, well, how healthy are you? Because human beings are like magnets. We attract people on our level of health. We engage people on our level of health.
Mm.
So there's a lot to look at when it comes to the health of our relationships. It tells us a lot.
And when you do that deep dive into your own mind, soul, being, however you want to put it, is there ever a way where you can dig too deep to ask whether or not you're okay, or to find out the root cause of, why you may be having some toxic behaviors? Because I feel like it could be a really deconstructive process to try and find answers to those questions that might be a really negative thing for people to do.
It is not easy. That's the truth. Can you ever dig too deep? I think the answer to that is no. I think even in scripture, we see that, the purposes of a person's heart are like deep waters. That's what Proverbs tells us. But one who has insight draws them out.
Hmm.
So you've got to go in and draw out those waters. I mean, imagine a well in ancient Bible days. You don't just turn on a faucet and out comes the
Yeah.
water. You have to go deep and
Mm.
work and be intentional. And that's what I think, we're called to do right now in this season. We look at our life And we've got all these things that we struggle with that trip us up today. Like I said, it could be an addiction. It could be something we're struggling with, a sin in our life that we just can't kick. It could be the struggles of depression, anxiety, panic. We might even be feeling suicidal at times or having these negative thoughts. And at the end of the day, we try to kind of deal with this stuff superficially. We numb ourselves, we distract ourselves, or we kind of deal with it at the tip. If you imagine these problems kind of like a weed,
Yeah.
we cut off the tip of the weed, but without getting to the root. And if we don't get to the root of why we're behaving the way that we are, why we're repeating the patterns that we are, it's going to keep happening again and again and again. So I don't think there is such a thing as getting too deep. I think going deep is exactly where we need to go to get healthy.
Right. So if you are wanting to start that journey of not just cutting off the head, but really getting to some of those roots, what kind of questions or what kind of process do you need to go through so that you're doing that effectively, asking the right questions and walking through the right process?
Well, I would start with getting a journal and starting to keep track of things in your life. First, I would start with keeping track of my present behavior, thoughts, feelings, and relationships. What are the red flags I'm seeing in my life right now in those areas? If you were to come in to see me for counseling, the first thing I would have you do in your journal is to draw me a timeline of events from childhood to today that have had a significant impact on you. Because I think there's a lot of things that we go through and experience, things that I would call childhood wounds that actually affect us to the core. But we don't really stop and deal with them. We've got past trauma that we go through, hard things. And sometimes we just keep going, hoping that time is just going to heal it. But time alone doesn't heal those wounds. We have to be intentional about facing them and confronting them. And honestly, I know I'm biased, but I think counseling is a really important part of the journey because a counselor can help you dig deep in these areas. When I wrote, Are You Really Okay? I stop every chapter with what I call checkup questions at the end. Check up emotionally, check up questions for your mental health, for your emotional health, spiritual health, physical health, because we often go to the doctor to get that physical checkup, that annual. We don't even like to go to it. But
Yeah.
how often do we stop and do a checkup emotionally, mentally? How are we actually doing? I think the first thing we really need to do is to stop and to ask ourselves some hard questions.
And I think I heard you express the idea of going to a counselor somewhere. I mean, people have all their different perspectives on doing that or not, but thankfully I think sort of society culture is starting to become more okay and less critical of people that actually do decide to go to a counselor. But I remember you putting it saying it this way somewhere, that it's not like going to a doctor because you're sick. You're going to the gym, like you're looking after yourself. You're putting in that preventative work.
Yes, I love that you remembered that because it's true. I think too many people see it like, oh, I'm sick and going to the doctor. It's like a shameful thing. I'm down. But the funny thing is, we even do that. Even though we don't like to go to the doctor, we do it. But when it comes to our mental and emotional health, we're like, oh gosh, I don't want to admit that I'm struggling. Maybe it's not that bad. And we just push through. But again, going to the gym, that's what you have to see it like. This is a mental and emotional workout. You are strengthening those muscles, You should be high-fiving each other for going to counseling because you are staying on top of it and getting yourself to live in a healthy way.
Yeah, you're not getting lost in the abyss of your own mind. You're actually having someone kind of guide you through some of these good questions to be asking. And one of them that came to mind for me when we look at this concept of whether or not we're okay or not is that realization that I think many of us find at various points in life that we can actually not be okay, that it's possible for us to be broken and to realize that, we can't do everything. And that can be a real challenge to suddenly realize that you're not invincible. So when you face that hurdle that can be demotivating and really get you off track in so many ways, how do you think we can kind of step over that realization that we are breakable and we can be not all right?
Yeah. I honestly think it's more dangerous for us to think that we're okay than it is for us to think that we're not okay.
Mm.
Because when we recognize that we're not okay, we're at a place to receive healing. We're at a place to grow and change and transform and get to the next level of healing. Whereas when we think we're doing fine, that's when we're actually the most susceptible because our guard is down, our eyes are closed to what is actually happening. So I see the thought of being not okay as a really powerful and courageous place to be.
Mm.
So even just reframing how we think of that and realizing, you know what, behind the Instagram filters, we're all not okay in some way,
Yeah.
shape, or form. You know what I mean?
Mm.
Like, let's just get real with how we're doing, because we know that we're all human beings. We all suffer. We all struggle with something in
Mm.
different seasons. You know, it might be different in different times of your life, but we've all got something that
Yeah.
we are working on. And I want people to realize that it's not a setback. Like when you find something new, it's like, oh, here I go again. I thought I kicked this. I'm
Mm.
feeling anxious again. I'm struggling with pornography again, dot, 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 dot. You've got to see it as, okay, Lord, this is the next layer of healing. What do you want to do
Mm.
now? You want to heal me one more level. You want to take me a little deeper. And instead of getting discouraged and running from healing, we need to see it as God saying, this is the next level. I'm about to do something new. Let's do
Mm.
this together. And that we move toward healing instead of run away from it.
That is such a powerful thought. And then, in your perspective, would you reframe it for that person who feels like it's a real demotivator to realize that, they could put all their effort into something, but it could all fall apart because they're not perfect? Would you reframe that to be something that allows them to say, I am going to still step forward, but being more vulnerable, not thinking that I'm in charge of it or that it all has to kind of rest with me, if that makes sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would also remind them that healing isn't linear. You don't just get better and better and better every day. Healing is cyclical. It goes through cycles where, you work on certain things and then you might go backwards a little bit, but then the next time forward you're even stronger. And
Mm.
then you might go back a little bit, but then the next time you're even better. Healing is cyclical. And I think when we look at healing as just the next step forward with no setbacks, we will
Mm.
get discouraged because that's not life. That's not realistic.
Mm.
Real healing is sometimes two steps forward, one step back, but we're getting closer and closer to Jesus. We're getting closer to becoming all that God has called us to be
Mm.
every step of the way.
Where do you think resilience fits into the conversations around well-being? Because I know that on the plus side, as we become more willing to admit our vulnerabilities and admit, we need a personal day or whatever it might be, I personally have seen people use that as an excuse to not step up, to not rise to the occasion, to just kind of, I guess, disconnect from life in some ways. Where does resilience come in to kind of hear these things that are going on in our minds, but kind of step up and I hesitate to use the word push through because I know that can be
Yeah.
perceived really negatively. But yeah, what's your view on where we just need to be resilient sometimes?
Well, I think there's a difference between giving up, repressing, ignoring, and numbing ourselves to our pain, which to me, that almost sounds more of what you're talking about, where people are not willing to engage with their pain. They just want to shut off. They just want to turn on Netflix. They just want to stop going to work. They just want to take a break. That's not engaging with healing. That's running away from healing. Obviously we need to have time for rest built into our life. But when we find ourselves running from pain, running from difficult emotions, running from hard things, then we're not actually moving toward healing, because healing is an active process. It's something that we're walking towards. It takes strength, it takes intention, it takes work. And so I think sometimes the people who are wanting to hide under the covers and not come out are really the ones that are struggling most with that victim mentality. Like, life is so bad, poor, pitiful me.
Mm.
And when you're in that place, that is a sign that it's time for healing. That is a sign that you need help. And if you can't motivate yourself to get there, you need to partner with somebody, a mentor, a counselor, a friend. This is where getting honest about how we're doing matters.
Mm.
We need to get honest with ourselves, with God, but also with the people around us, especially when we're feeling stuck and unable to move forward. To invite those people in our life that we can be honest with and say, you know what, I'm not really okay. And I need you to help me take the next step.
Mm. And it can be not okay to so many varying degrees. Like, it doesn't have to be the extremes of depression. It
Right.
can just be life is overwhelming and I just need a little extra help in the daily grind.
100%. It can be, I'm struggling to express my emotions in a healthy way. I'm having too much anger. I'm wasting my time instead of spending it wisely.
Mm.
I'm having unhealthy relationships. I'm really struggling with insecurity and how I feel about my body, how I feel about myself, how I feel about my relationships. I'm struggling with trust issues. If you stop and think, you can really start to identify the things in your life today that you need to deal with. It doesn't have to
Mm.
be debilitating, but it's those little things that when we leave them and ignore them, that they begin to grow. And
Mm.
then they get to a place that they're debilitating. That's why I always say we think we're okay until we're not. But we
Mm.
want to stay ahead of it. We want to do that preventative maintenance so that we don't get to that difficult, dark place.
And this is something that you're talking about, not just from the perspective of a counselor, but from your own personal experience as well. What were some of the things in your life that made you realize, hey, you're not actually okay, and you maybe have some things that you need to do work on yourself?
You know, I went through a series of unexpected panic attacks that kind of came out of nowhere, but they didn't come out of nowhere because none of this stuff comes out of nowhere. It
Yeah.
just seems to come out of nowhere, right? So for me, a few years before those panic attacks started, I had gone through a really traumatic miscarriage where I lost a
Mm.
baby, but I also almost lost my life. I was minutes away from dying. And years later, I kind of moved forward and dealt with that difficult experience, but I didn't realize that trauma like that would come back to bite me
Mm.
later. But that's exactly how trauma works. You can go through something really difficult, but in the moment you're in survival mode. It's like when a soldier goes off to war, they're on the battlefield, they're in survival mode. Their
Mm.
body's just like, I just want you to keep you alive.
Yeah.
We're not here to process what's happening. And then later on, when they come back home and life is safe and secure, that trauma begins to come up and it's like, now it's time to deal with me. And that's exactly what happened for me. A few years later, that trauma began to come back up in my body. And I started experiencing a series of panic attacks. And here I
Mm.
am, I'm a licensed counselor, I'm a professional, I help people
Mm.
with panic attacks. But licensed counselors aren't immune to mental health struggles, just like
Mm.
pastors aren't immune to spiritual struggles, doctors aren't immune to physical struggles. We're all susceptible. And for me, that was the journey of facing my trauma and facing my thinking, my negative thoughts, my experiences, those hard things that I had been through, facing what my body was dealing with,
Mm.
and learning to get healthy from the inside out.
It's an important message to listen to your body and to give yourself space to actually process what you've been through. And I can't even imagine what that would have been like for you, but you've been able to share so much wisdom from it. And one of the things that I draw away from your journey and even what you've mentioned in this conversation so far is the need for connection, how humans need support through some of those things. And we need those people that can rally around us. In some of the expertise that you have around relationships, what have you found as to why humans need connection? Why do we seek out friendship and relationship?
God made us for connection. He wired us for relationships. If we look at just the very nature of our relationship with God, he made us to be in relationship with him and with others. And I think sometimes in the big C church, we can feel ashamed of our desire for relationships and especially romantic relationships.
Mm.
It's like, maybe if I have a desire for marriage, I don't love Jesus enough, or he hasn't filled that void. Because sometimes we hear that. It's like,
Mm.
well, maybe you wouldn't want a relationship so much if you ... But no, there's no guilt, no shame there because we were made for relationships. Your
Mm.
desire for love is not a reflection of your lack of faith. Your desire for love is a reflection that you were made in the image of a God who made you for love.
Mm.
And instead of trying to snuff out that desire with all kinds of other things, I think we need to embrace it. I think we need to lean into that desire and figure out what it looks like to act out and enable those relationships in healthy ways.
What are the markers that you see that show us we need more connection or maybe even less connection? Like we're kind of too engaged with too many people. What do you think some of those markers are?
Well, in Are You Really Okay, as well as in some of my other courses, what I have people do is to draw a 3-ring target. So you've got the small circle with a middle-sized circle and a big circle. And then I want you to ask yourself, how many people are in my core group, that inner circle? Jot down a couple names, a couple initials of people who are there for you. They know everything about you. They are there for you thick and thin. Then the next layer are what we call our friends, our friend zone, right? The people that are there for you, but maybe they don't know the ins and outs of your life, you know? And then the third group are your acquaintances, the people that are kind of your friends by default, maybe at work or at church, you run into them, your neighbors, these acquaintances you have in your life. And then analyze that graph for me. We call it a social map. Analyze it for me. If you have way too many people in group 3, that tells me that maybe you like to keep your relationships a little superficial. Maybe there's something preventing you from bringing people into that inner circle. And maybe you find yourself feeling lonely, even though you're surrounded by these people, because they're not really getting close to you at your heart. They're not getting close to you emotionally. But what happens if you look at your social map and maybe you notice that there's nobody in that inner circle? They're all in level 2 and level 3, but you're hardly letting anyone into that inner core of who you are. What is preventing you from vulnerability? What is preventing you from opening up and getting real about who you are, how you're doing with others? So a social map like that is just a quick activity, but it can tell us so much about the way that we structure our relationships and where we need to make some changes based on if one of the levels is too full or too empty.
It's so helpful in that kind of visual way as well. And this isn't a judgment on anyone's relationship status, but do you think that we have to have a romantic relationship to fill that void, that need for connection?
100% no. Because that is not always in our control. We were made for love, but we weren't necessarily made for romantic love because honestly, sometimes you're going to be in a season where you are single, and sometimes that season lasts a lot longer than you ever expected, right? And if that is how we fill a void, then we're doomed. I really despise the phrase soulmates because it's almost like this indication that somebody else is supposed to fill your soul. Someone else is supposed to complete you. I don't even like the term significant other because that tells me that there's only one person that's significant, and that's my romantic relationship. We have so many significant others. We're designed to have many people who are of significance because they're adding something to our life, that we're exchanging something with one another. God made us for that community. And I think we need to really reframe how we view romantic relationships, because when we are living for that one relationship, we miss out on so many other relationships that God has given us.
And maybe it's because this could be a generalization, but I guess it's one version of how people may see things, is that in a romantic relationship, in a marriage relationship, you've got that person who kind of knows you more than anyone else and that you can share so much of your life with. And maybe we relegate that to romantic relationships where maybe some of our other relationships can have that kind of intimacy. Is that kind of true, that you don't have to have that relationship only with someone who you'd consider your romantic partner?
It's absolutely true. And we see examples of that in scripture. I mean, look at Jonathan and David, the friendship that they had that was so intimate and so real and so important. Look at Jesus and his disciples and the intimacy and the friendships that were there. Not only that, but I also think sometimes we idealize marriage and we look at it through a rose-colored lens, because I know as a therapist, I see the back end of it where
Mm.
the majority of marriages aren't actually functioning in that way,
Mm.
even though they should be, right? It actually takes a lot of work to get to the point where your marriage is functioning in the way where that person is your closest friend, your partner.
Mm.
And I think if we begin to practice healthy relationships before we're married, it will set us up for having healthy relationships within our marriage. A
Mm.
lot of the work we do in becoming healthy, standing alone, is work that will go with us into our marriage,
Mm.
because you're only as healthy in marriage as you are as a single person standing alone.
Mm. So if you're somebody then who is maybe looking for a life partner, or even good friends, people that you know can be solid allies in life, what are the sort of questions you think you should be asking them to get a gauge if they're the right people to connect your life with?
You know, I wonder if it's as simple as a question, or if it's more of how we are observing them and how they live their life. I always say that the overflow of a person's life is going to tell you a lot about the kind of person that they are. And I also think for us, we need to know who we are standing alone in order to know the type of people who match our life from the type of people who don't match our life.
Mm.
If you think about human beings kind of like a puzzle, you know, when you are trying to put a puzzle together, if you just grab two random puzzle pieces from the box and try to jam them together, you're going to do some damage to those puzzle pieces. They're
Mm.
probably not going to fit, right? Isn't that though how we do relationships sometimes? We just kind of grab people at random, try
Mm.
to jam them into our life and hope it works. But we end up with a lot of broken hearts, even in friendship. But the healthiest way to do this is to start looking at myself, getting to know myself. When I understand my shape, when I understand my colors, when I know who I am,
Mm.
what I'm all about, my morals, my values, my vision for my life, my goals, my dreams, my calling, my personality, my identity, then I will quickly recognize the type of peace that fits into my life from the
Mm.
type of peace that doesn't. I'll recognize the relationships that match my life from the relationships that don't. And so I think the first step is really backing up and saying, do I really know myself? Do I have a good gauge of who I am and what God has called me to? Do
Mm.
I really understand my identity, my strengths, my weaknesses? Because when I know myself, I have a better understanding of the type of people who fit into my life from the type of people who don't.
Yeah, and none of us want toxic relationships in our life. I think it's so good these days that these ideas of toxic relationships are being brought up and kind of put in the foreground so much more, whether it is verbally abusive, emotionally abusive, physically abusive, all of it. We're much more aware of what it looks like to be kind of a toxic person. How do you know if you're in a toxic relationship? Because aside from physical abuse, and even sometimes then that can be really confusing, so many of the toxic qualities relationships can have aren't always apparent to the people in them. So how do you think we can realize if we're in a toxic relationship or not?
I think the basic question is, does this relationship lift me higher or bring me down? And we're not just talking about physically, like you said, we're talking emotionally, we're talking spiritually, we're talking mentally. Do I leave this relationship feeling better about who I am, feeling challenged to grow in my walk with the Lord, feeling encouraged in our communication and our emotional expression, feeling encouraged about who I am? Or do I leave this relationship feeling worse about who I am, feeling stuck in my emotions, feeling obstacles in the communication, feeling like all it is fighting and arguing and tension?
Mm.
You know, is this relationship adding to my life or taking away from who I am and who God has called me to be? And I think really taking inventory of that, because it's easy to make excuses. I always say the best way to attract a jerk is to start making excuses.
Yep.
Oh, he didn't call me because he's so busy, or she's just flirting with those guys because she's just really nice. You know, she's a nice person. If you want to attract a jerk into your life, you just keep making excuses for them instead of
Mm.
seeing what they're doing for what it is. Instead of seeing their potential, I'm looking at who they are today, what they are doing today. There's too many people out there that suffer with the too nice syndrome. They are just too kind, too nice. They're giving too much in the relationship and expecting little to nothing in return. Think about it this way. Relationships are like a plant. If you give it too much, you're going to kill it. Just as if you give it too little, you're going to kill it. The healthiest relationships are made of give and take, give and take. You are giving and you're receiving, and vice versa. And you're encouraging each other along the way.
This is really a great counseling session for all of us. I'm kind of like mentally taking notes for myself in this right now. And even that thing of being too nice. And I think of, particularly for our Christian listeners, that's something that we can be so predisposed to because of the narrative of forgiveness and grace that is so important within our faith. One of the other things we can get hung up on is the role of physical intimacy in relationships, whether that's as basic as a hug or right to the full level of having sex with somebody. What do you see the role of physical intimacy being in a relationship? Where does it fit?
Physical intimacy is not a bad thing. And I think it's something that we have to be careful not to do away with altogether. I think sometimes we take the extreme of like, we can't even touch each other, like, don't even look at me. We're going to save our kiss to the wedding day. Otherwise we're sinning. I think there's those extremes, but the funny thing is those extremes also have repercussions, because I see people in counseling who are now married, but unable to be physically intimate because of all the shame and guilt they've carried. So there's the extreme, but then the other extreme is having no boundaries and not seeing sex as a sacred place and allowing the physical relationship to lead the way. But here's the thing about it, especially when it comes to sex in a relationship, I kind of see sex as this steam pipe that releases pressure. If you think about a steam pipe with me, a steam pipe kind of brings pressure back and forth. The steam is going back and forth. And that's kind of a great imagery for a relationship. And what happens with a steam pipe is when there's a buildup of pressure, that's when you start to see the cracks. So if there's problems in the steam pipe, you're going to start to see them when the pressure builds. And that's the same with relationships. Pressure needs to build in a relationship. And sometimes it's sexual pressure. Sometimes it's emotional pressure. Sometimes it's conflict. But if you're having sex prematurely in a relationship, what you're doing is you're releasing that pressure through sex. So it's almost like adding a valve to release that pressure. But when you do, you never get to see the cracks. You never get a chance to fix them and deal with them. And then you bring all of those broken cracks into marriage. If you would have seen them, you might have said, this isn't a good thing for me. This isn't even fixable. And so that's the other extreme where people are using sex as a pressure release, masking their issues with their sexual relationship. And so neither extremes are healthy. I think we can, as Christians, be in a place where we're having healthy interactions and healthy physical connection, healthy emotional connection, healthy spiritual connection, keep our boundaries in place, and still be able to function in relationships. I think that is not only possible, but I think it's what we should begin to expect of ourselves.
And I think it means the conversation around boundaries of all kinds, that to me, that kind of needs like a rethink, because I know in the way that I grew up, like boundaries were really firm around, what you should and shouldn't do in a romantic context. But there wasn't really a conversation around just setting healthy boundaries in friendships, whether that's just, sharing your own opinion on something and expecting it to be respected. It doesn't always have to be about the sexual side of things. So when we talk about that idea of setting healthy boundaries, how do you think we do that?
Boundaries are so key to any healthy relationship because they protect you and they protect that person. They protect the relationship. You got to see boundaries kind of like that fence that keeps the bad things out and lets the good things in. That's kind of the role of boundaries in our life. So we should even talk spiritual boundaries. We should talk emotional boundaries. When we talk emotional and spiritual boundaries, I always say we have a tendency as Christians to dive into the deep end of relationships right away. Yeah. Like, I don't even know what's in this water yet, but I am diving in because you're a Christian, I'm a Christian. We can trust each other. That's having no boundaries in a relationship. We have to start at the shallow end and then slowly move into the deep end as we find this person can be trusted. I think part of the problem, and I can say this for myself as a Christian, is that we falsely believe that trust is something you give rather than believing that trust is something that needs to be earned.
Hmm.
You shouldn't just give. Trust isn't a present that you give. Trust is something that someone has to earn from you. And when we can see trust in that way, I think it helps us set those boundaries. Okay, I don't know if I can trust this person yet, so I'm not going to share these intimate details of my life. I don't know if I can trust this person yet, so I'm not going to spend the majority of my waking hours with them until I really get to know who they are and what they're made of. I don't know if I can trust this person yet with these deep, dark secrets of my life, so I'm just going to hold them close for now.
Mm.
And learning to protect our heart, learning to expect certain actions as our signal of whether or not we can trust somebody. Just if we could see trust in that way, it's not a present.
Mm.
It's something someone has to earn. And when trust is broken, forgiveness doesn't just mean, okay, I trust you again. No, we got to start this process from scratch. We've got to build up again so that I can get to a place where that I can trust you.
Yeah, and it sounds like that the timing of that and the way that works is going to be so different for everyone. But Debra, you have shared so much wisdom for all of us right now. Is there anything else you wanted to share before we wrap it up?
I would say if I could just say one last thing, it would be the reminder that when you get healthy standing alone, it impacts everything. It impacts your future life, your relationships, your future marriage, your family, your friendships. It impacts the way that you enjoy and live life abundantly. And so if I could give one last call to action, that would be, let's see 2021 as the year of healing. 2020 exposed so much junk. It brought out so much stress and emotions and difficult things to the surface. And if we just move on and pretend that all that stuff isn't there, we're not really going to enter a place of healing. But 2021 can be a year of healing if we will begin to face some of this stuff, bring it before the Lord, take that next action step, and really start getting healthy from the inside out.
Well, we're going to make that choice together with you, Debra. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.